Hi, I'm Michael.
And I'm Justin.
And this is our podcast where we discuss what we find interesting about the intersection of Web3 and digital security as we know it.
Between us, we have years of experience securing digital products and infrastructure, which has led us to be constantly curious about what's next.
Which is what this podcast is about, sharing our journey as we update our mental models for security in the next internet.
And this is our fourth episode at the time of recording. We don't record these relatively close together. We actually record these as and when we get the brainwaves, because this isn't supposed to be a serial. This is just our joint exploration into a technology that we find interesting and its potential consequences. And so today, the topic that I got hit by a lightning bolt a few weeks back that I thought, how is that going to work in Web3, is the idea of identity. This is a subject that is very close to Michael's heart because I know he works a lot with identity in his professional space. Me, I come across it normally when I'm in my professional space as normally as a feature of another web app or another architecture. So I don't work as closely, but I have a good working knowledge of it. But yeah, so my understanding of the thought that I had was basically, how does identity work in a decentralized distributed ledger or even in a blockchain environment? Sorry to throw all those words out, but basically, long story short, how does identity work in Web3? And so I pitched that question to Michael, and I have a few questions myself. So I guess we should start with the first question that comes to my mind, as well, for the listeners as well, is, well, what is identity management in general? And what do we mean identity management when we work in tech or IT? Mm-hmm. What do we mean by that phrase? So I'll go first from my understanding, and then I'll let Michael jump in. So effectively, identity, when we talk about identity from the computer science perspective, we're not asking the deep soul searching question, who are you? It's more of, who are you? So what do I mean? What's the difference between the two? Is in order for you to authenticate to a system, for example, or for you to be granted access rights to a resource on any system, and by a system here I mean the pejorative sense of, it could be a computer, it could be a network of computers, it could be something that is hosted digitally. That system needs to know who you are, and that is what we call and what we refer to by identity. In order for a system to be able to do that, as are all our understandings as the average layperson's understanding of any digital identity, you basically present an identity, I am Justin at hotmail.com, to a centralized authority, and that centralized authority says, okay, if you are Justin, please present an authentication credential. So in order to authenticate, you need an identity. In order for a system to know who you are or what you're trying to achieve, you need an identity. In order for a system to define or basically, in order for a system to define your access rights within a given system, you need an identity. So that's what we mean by identity. And the two are normally decoupled. Identity is the basis of authentication or authorization. You can't have one without the other. But we'll see later, Web3 kind of collapses that and does some weird stuff with that. But yeah, so Michael, that's my ramble. What do you think identity is, and how does it work in our current state of being?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, we wouldn't be true to ourselves if we didn't go like immediately philosophical about like what is identity, right? So like, you first asked me this question like a few weeks ago or whatever it was, and I was thinking about it a lot because I don't think it's like a simple question to answer. Like like when we talk about identity on the internet, or in a system, like what is an identity in a system, right? And I was like really trying to boil it down to like first principles, like what is an identity. And I think there's a few ways that you could look at it. Like, I came up with a few different statements. Okay. So I'll hit you with them and get your reaction. So one is, an identity is a unique attribute in a database. I think there's a way in which this is kind of the most fundamental picture of what an identity is, right?
Yeah.
And an identity is defined primarily by its uniqueness, right? Like, there can only be one. So there's different ways to express that. Like you could say it's like a primary key
Mm-hmm.
in the database, in
Yeah.
a database, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, but like systems have lots of databases and lots
Yeah.
of tables and lots of columns that are unique or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or that have a uniqueness constraint on them. So like that's not like all that it is.
Yeah.
So I think it's like classically it's like the combination of that plus um the ability plus a bundle of attributes that go along with being identified as that row essentially.
Okay.
What do you think? What are you thinking so far? Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I'm basically you've gone down to the fundamental nature of how an identity is represented in a technical system, and I actually like that because you're keeping it true to what it actually is as opposed to what it actually does.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
Uh,
yeah, go on.
no, okay. Like, okay, a few things that are interesting, I think, falling out of this. One
Mm-hmm.
is when you said, like, you were saying, like, what is identity? And you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
okay, like, I roll up to some app and I say, I am justin@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
So, one, if you knew, like, nothing about the internet, right, it should be a little bit weird that your identity is a email address, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I don't even think you could say that what you said is like a domain name. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so one, there's like a weird association there that's partially historical, partially circumstantial,
Mm-hmm.
kind of accretion with how the internet works. That like our identity
Yeah.
is like fundamentally an email,
Yeah.
which is something we talked about the other day.
We have discussed that and my opinions there.
But I think like anyway, we can go about reasons for that, but it's not necessarily like
Mm-hmm.
Web3 related, though maybe in a back channel way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was thinking about, okay, is this concept still true in Web3 was the next place I was going with this.
Yeah.
Like,
So basically, how does it translate to a Web3
like,
website?
does this like if if I think, okay, like I think I've got this fundamental concept of what identity is, in that
Mm-hmm.
it's like basically a primary key in like a table.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or it's an entry in like an abstract database that is unique, and maybe be
Mm-hmm.
another way of putting it. Does that carry over to Web3? Do
Okay.
you do you
So,
think? Well,
what
you go ahead.
I think you kind of answer your own question with that. That's a leading question because the one thing the one defining attribute about Web3 is that it's decentralized.
Mm-hmm.
So, what you're therefore saying is, well, sorry, not authorization. If identity is centralized in nature, how does that translate or is stored in a centralized manner? That's actually, I guess, a bigger point there. Is stored or actually implemented in a centralized manner. How is identity, or how would you implement identity in a decentralized manner? I think it's a leading question in my mind when you make that statement about it being a primary key in a DB or a series of DBs, because you could have federated identity as well, but still they're still centralized. They're just distributed. That's all. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a very good question because, and this is where I guess we get to the difference between identity as expressed in Web 2 and how that would translate to Web 3. Because in Web 3, nothing, how do you explain? Well, your identity is effectively your wallet address, number one.
Yeah. Okay. So one place you
Oh,
can
you got,
take it. One place you can take
yeah.
it, right, is the abstract table that your
Mm-hmm.
identity exists in is the key space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and your claim to identity is a unique
Mm-hmm.
record in like the abstract kind of key space,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, so that's one side of it. Like you have, like, obviously you have the uniqueness part of identity, and that is kind of that is fundamentally distributed because everything is referencing the same abstract
Okay. So
database.
are
You
you
know what I mean?
saying this in a Web 2 or in a Web 3? Or
That's in Web
so you're
three.
saying, yeah, okay.
Um, well, it could be in both because your
Okay.
identity in Web 2 can also be a key
Hmm.
pair, can also be like an entry in the like
Hmm.
platonic ideal key space or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, in when we're talking about Web 3, then like the crossover and like the way that identity is the concept of identity like crosses over like is you have that uniqueness, right?
Hmm.
And then we're saying like maybe it's not just uniqueness, it's uniqueness plus a bundle of attributes,
Hmm.
right? um and then I think that's where things get kind of interesting in a distributed way.
So can I jump in
Yeah.
there when you say uniqueness plus a bundle of attributes? Because to my mind, the attributes are associated to a key, but you initially, at its fundamental level, I think an identity is just an identity. The attributes don't make the identity. An identity can have attributes.
Okay.
That's the way I think of it in my mind. Because with or without the attributes, I'm still Justin, and I'm still professing to be this identity that then has attributes associated to it, which then allow me or disallow or don't allow me access to resources, systems, networks. Do you see my point? So that's one thing. I think to me, the way you're describing it, it sounds as though you're saying an identity is identity plus attributes. And I'm like, well, an identity can have attributes, but an identity can also have no attributes, depending on the context the system's operating in. What do you think?
Yeah. What do I think? So I think that attributes, um so if we think of attributes as like a proxy to get a set of capabilities,
Mm-hmm.
um then I think you're right. uh I think in my mind I'm kind of collapsing the two, which maybe isn't fair, but like let's say like identity is like the uniqueness plus a set of
Mm-hmm.
capabilities that you have because you are that uniqueness.
Mm-hmm.
So then uh I think there's a theoretical way in which you can say if the identity itself is just the uniqueness and
Mm-hmm.
there's no capabilities, um, then then there's really no difference between one identity and another identity. Like they are,
Other, oh, so you're saying the attributes confer the uniqueness in of itself?
well, they are unique. Like they like things may be different, like rows in a table or whatever, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah, exactly.
if I can't do anything with a claim to that individuality, like if I can't do anything with a claim to be
Hmm.
that identity, then it's
Hmm.
kind of like inert, right?
Oh, this is where you and I disagree. This is good. Okay, so yes, it's inert, but I think it's funny. We're not disagreeing. We're just talking about it at two different angles. So yes, it's inert. Obviously, if one click, if my identity has the same attribute makeup as yours, then there is no differentiation between the two of us. But that is only from a system perspective,
Hmm.
and that's only from an access perspective, I guess, really and truly. Um, because at the end of the day, we're still individuals with different ideas. Because I'm just and you're Michael. The difference is inherent with the fact that they're not the same as identities, right? I think it's why. Let me ask you a
Okay.
question. Why have you collapsed the two?
Attribute
That's the
what
thing.
which two?
You collapse the identity and the attributes associated with a given identity. Why have you collapsed that to be? Because in my mind, the way I've understood your point, that's kind of one big ball is identity with identity written on it. And if you go down, kind of like a subatomic particle, if you go down and look deeper, it's actually identity, i.e., your ID and your associates. And then that, when you zoom out at a different level of abstraction, that to you is the identity. Whereas to me, the identity in of itself is complete by itself by just having an ID. So why have you collapsed them? What's making you do that?
I think what's making me do that is um probably being like overly theoretical about it.
But
like I think the point in my head is that if I am an identity on if I'm an identity on the internet or in an ecosystem, and I can't do anything as that identity, then there's no power to that identity. Like there's no ability to operate as that identity.
This is true.
And if I can't operate as that identity, then there's nothing that, like, there's no way to differentiate.
So the only differentiation, I guess, okay, 2 points I would say is, if there's no power to the identity because you have no attributes for the identity, that is system dependent, right? So if I write a hello world application and put an authentication mechanism in front of it, we still have different IDs to sign in with, but we just get the same hello world back as a static Times New Roman page. Whereas, so that's system dependent. The second point I was going to come back to was the power to do something. Oh, I've lost the point. I hate being old. Okay. Yeah, I've actually lost the point. The second point, you're talking about the power to do something. Therefore, I think you're basically, are you saying that it renders the identity almost pointless in the fact that it has no differentiation or it has no attributes to do something? I think that's what
yeah, sure. Let's go with that. I don't know. I should probably move on from this particular.
Because I think that's kind of down the line.
Yeah.
And I do want to pull us back to, okay, let's translate this concept because, all right, boom. So we know ID is basically implemented in a centralized fashion. That's centralized distributed fashion. That's kind of how it is in Web 2. You basically present your ID, you then profess to be this person and then you authenticate, and then you get a bunch of access rights. How does that work in Web 3 where, number one, you don't profess to have an ID to any central authority? You basically have your wallet, your private key, and you're able to sign transactions and you're able to interact with decentralized apps. But at the same time, they don't authenticate you. You, in fact, in a way, the way I kind of understand it is you authenticate them really, truly, because they'll say, oh, we're going to write this transaction to the chain on your behalf, but you need to sign it, for example. That is a very different mode of doing things and a very different way of thinking. It's even when the longer I think about it, the more my head hurts, because I'm like, oh, that's completely interesting. What do you think of that?
So yeah, I think if we reach back to one of the, I think we talked about this in one of our first episodes about how the dominant narrative of technology on the internet, which is what we love talking about, right? Is the power differential between clients and servers, right?
Yep.
And Web 2, the political economy of Web 2, I think was the term that we put to it, right? Is that...
Yeah, that's going to be the name of your book.
Yeah, it is, yeah. When I get ChatGPT to write it or whatever. Is that servers, the arc of history, if you will, in Web 2 is that servers collect power and servers are the gravitational kind of sinks of power, right? And that's reflected in identity as well, because the server is what gives you identity, right? Absent the server, you have no identity in Web 2. Yeah. In Web 2, you only have the identity you have to the extent that the server permits you to have the identity that you have.
Agreed.
And like everything else, Web 3 is an inversion of that, which is what you're identifying, right? In Web 3, nothing gives you your identity, right? You've generated your identity yourself in the form of a key pair. And as you said, the power relationship is actually almost inverted, because it's actually things can't happen in the compute space of Web 3 as your identity unless you have proven in your own power as the client that thing should happen, sort of, right? Whereas Web 2 is not like that at all. Web 2 things can happen all the time as your identity and that's one of the fundamental security, I don't know, movements or like analyses of things in Web 2 is like when identities misbehave in kind of the compute space because the actor is not actually executing them, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what you're identifying, right? Like
Yeah.
that the political calculus is inverted going from Web 2 to Web 3, and that plays out in identity as well, because identity is a client native concept in Web 3, whereas in Web 2 identity is a server native concept.
100%. So do we actually like that though? Because for
Just cut
example,
out all the first part of the podcast and only have that part.
You look like a genius. So basically, what's interesting about that is when I look at the Web3 implementation of it, I'm like, okay, so you have your wallet ID, you have your private key that is hosted by your wallet, and if you lose your wallet, if you lose control of that wallet, you're done. It's all borderline fatal as it goes in the and whereas in Web 2, if I lose my identity, I can recover. We have a whole ecosystem of mechanisms that can be done to recover your identity. And I think what's funny about that, what gives me a bit of the heebie-jeebies about it in the Web3 implementation is it's based, well, number one, the Web3 implementation stems from the original I think it was Bitcoin white paper, or even blockchain concept of immutability, i.e., once it's written to the blockchain, it exists in perpetuity as that thing. And I think if you lose your web key, your private key, then tough. Like, it's that code is law, and you should have looked after it. I find that to be incomplete opposite of not even complete opposite. Let me choose my words better here. Basically, it's not a user-friendly experience, long story short, because people lose control of their credentials, which is what you present, which is what identity is, right? There are a set of credentials that are either verified by a centralized third party, or you actually own them and you're that first party owner of your own set of credentials in Web3. Either way, if you lose your credentials in Web3, it can be catastrophic. In Web2, you can recover. And I think that's the one bit this is the one bit of the Web3 ecosystem that kind of gives me a bit of gives me pause, so to speak, in terms of the idea of collapsing this thing into one thing, your wallet. And again, we've talked about the nomenclature before, calling it a wallet when it's a completely different idea of a wallet that people understand. Wallets being private spaces in the real world, but wallets in Web3 are effectively public spaces because people can see what's in your wallet as well. I think that's the thing where I'm like, okay, I get why this happens. And obviously the pros of this is, as an individual, as a user, you're in control of your identity. Whereas in Web 2, again, as you said, with the political economy and all of that, you are not in control because control is given over to the aggregating services. Yeah, I said services such as your Metas, etc., etc. So you have control, but you really have control, and it's ultimate responsibility to them. But I think that's what's giving me the rub. Giving someone ultimate control over an abstraction that isn't something that naturally occurs to you as you grow up. Like, computers are an abstraction of things, of services, of provisions. And so it's kind of, I think it's risky to put our security hat on, to say, okay, if you're going to use my service that has no analog in your entire life other than what it is. A computer is a computer. Nothing else is like a computer per se. You have to learn to use it. You have to learn how it works. You have to learn all its foibles. I'm going to give you control over this abstraction, and here are your keys to this kingdom that is immensely powerful now because it's immensely efficient. I think you're asking for trouble. And that's where I think the Web3 implementation, the Web3 take on it is like, it gives me pause for thought. But I'm a power user, so I like the idea of being in control of my identity. What do you think?
Yeah, like I think like evidentially does it cause UX problems? Like yeah, absolutely, right? Like there is a sense in which Web3, like I think there's a sense in which you can analyze Web3 completely without a human. You know what I mean? Like it's abstract and reified. Like it's kind of abstracted and reified the concept of identity into the key pair so much that like it's almost tangential that there's a person who operates the key pair, right?
Which is crazy as a statement to say, right?
Yeah.
So who is this for then?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
let's
yeah.
get it. Sorry, go on.
So I mean, yeah, like future discussions on that. Um, I think that it's not impossible to design
Mm,
systems
mm,
that have contingencies for
mm.
data loss, right?
Agreed.
Um, and I think that because like our like in effect, one solution to the problem that you're identifying is to like Web2ify Web3 by
Mm.
having custodial wallets, right?
Yeah.
So like that's a solution where you take the Web3 identity in the key pair and you
Mm-hmm.
instead entrust it with
Mm-hmm.
a third party practically, um,
Mm-hmm.
and then they essentially
And then
give
you put
you
a Web two
a Web two
password in
interface,
front
and
of
not just a Web two interface in like the shallow,
mm,
like in the shallow like technical and UX sense, but it's also a Web two
mm.
interface in this political economy sense,
Yeah.
because then again, it's the server that's determining
Yeah.
your identity, your rights to your identity,
Mm-hmm.
your operation as that identity, all that kind of stuff, right?
And it's kind of crazy because so if you even look at something like a centralized exchange, they can decide what tokens you can buy. Not that this is not a crypto podcast, but it basically defines. You see how I got it in there. So basically, it defines what access rights you have to a concept that is an open
Yep.
ecosystem. You shouldn't be able to define. But yeah, I'm gonna let you
Yeah,
carry
yeah,
on.
no,
Sorry,
no,
feel
I
free.
know. I think it's interesting, right? It's like if you think of, it's almost like a segmented sort of chain where like the power dynamics like invert in the middle, and that's like the
Mm-hmm.
interface that you've created for the thing when you like
Mm-hmm.
introduce this concept. It's not necessarily a bad thing to do, right? Like
No.
like again, not making judgments
Mm-hmm.
on these things or these configurations, but like making
No. No.
observations about
Yeah.
how the dynamics of it play out on the internet. So that's like
Exactly.
one approach to designing for that problem, right? Is to like Web2ify Web3 and then call it
Mm-hmm.
solved.
Yeah.
um I don't think it's the only approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
And especially with like a lot of the recent noise around like MPC concepts and
Mm-hmm.
secret sharing, blah blah blah, like all the there are like some approaches that feel more crypto native
Mm-hmm.
that give a bit more flexibility with respect to like control of an identity, or like
Mm-hmm.
uh what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, it's gone. Whatever. But yeah, like that I agree that it's like a problem in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
people use the system and need to like recover within the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like another concept that we have talked about before, I don't know, I think in our own conversations,
Mm-hmm.
um is like, I don't know, maybe this was even on one of the podcasts we did. I don't know, they all meld together, right? um like when we look at security analysis of things going on in Web3,
Mm-hmm.
it's common that security issues get
Mm.
introduced at the points where they like dip into the Web2 world, right?
Yeah.
Um, and a lot of times, as you're like designing solutions to
Mm-hmm.
operate in Web3, like there's almost always a solution path, which is like compromise the Web3 and shim
Mm-hmm.
in like a Web2 interface to solve
Mm-hmm.
your problem.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea where I'm going
Yeah.
with this, but like you know what I
No,
mean.
I think I know exactly where you're going with it. So basically, the design decision to actually do the overlaying of Web 2 on a Web 3 um, implementation is where you are introducing inherently Web 2 vulnerabilities
Yes.
all over again. And obviously, we're not making judgments. So, but the problem is, we have yet to see, do we have any ideas of how you do it? How do you make something that is inherently, not inherently, Web3 isn't the most user friendly interface. How do you put the most user friendly interface on it in such a way that it carries on, it builds on what people already know, because we've learned about a bunch of past behaviors, username, passwords being one of the most famous, obviously, learned behaviors, because that's unique to computing. Like before that, when did you need a username and password before you first go on the computer? So everyone has a bunch of learned behaviors, and it's like, okay, well, this is the learned behavior for how you interact with this abstraction of this thing. We've now got a new version of this thing, Web3, which doesn't do what the old one did. And no, everyone's like, you what? So how do I do it? Okay, we're going to put a username and password in front of it. That's what we're going to do to make it easier for you to understand this. Is it a case of do we re-educate people again? Like it's funny talking about Web2 with OpenAI, right? I think I read an interview somewhere. I heard someone saying that prompt engineering shouldn't exist. You should just be able to use natural language and get the thing. But at the end of the day, you're still interfacing with a computer, and so there are ways in which you can interact with that computer and extract the most out of it, make sure you convey the meaning you want it to get. So now you have this whole cottage industry. It's not the cottage industry, it's now a real role of prompt engineering. People are literally learning how to talk in English or in whatever language that GPT is trained in such a way that it actually does the thing they want it to do. So that's re-education. That's my point now, is you re-educating people how to interface with a computer again. Do we want to do that in Web3, or do we want to continue down this path? And I think it also speaks to the development life cycle as well. I feel like, I mean, having been in tech scene for and messing with computers for 20 odd years now, or 30 odd years actually, basically re-education of a concept or a computing concept or a thing is possible, but it takes a long time. But rarely are the stakes as high as they are. I think what Web3, where I get a bit of a shiver around Web3 is it can be fatal to lose your key. And so these are the things where it's like, okay, so is this really something we want to have to re-educate people? Is it worth taking a re-education gamble, or is it worth actually just putting a Web2 pattern in front of it and therefore making it inherently easier for people to use and understand and therefore interact with? That will then naturally increase adoption, which will then hopefully create an ecosystem. People saying there's got to be a better way to do this. Is that, which way do you want to go down? Sorry, I just followed my
No,
thought.
no, no.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Like, I guess I just question whether um the, and like this could just be my own lack of knowledge and like experience in the space, right? But like I do question whether there actually is that like binary between like either it's Web3 and like if your hard drive reformats your toast, you know, or we have all the same problems as Web2 and you just have like a username and password to your keys. You know what I mean? Like
I don't think it's binary either. I agree with you, and I'm sorry I presented it.
No.
Way.
I like, but like, do you have it? I don't. I don't know if I read enough of what you sent me to know that you have a solution or not that you're building towards.
No, I do not have a solution. I'm still kicking around a few ideas. Sorry, the listeners are referencing. I have an idea around authentication in general, and I haven't publicized it yet. But anyway, but yeah, I don't even know if that solves that problem. I don't think it actually does.
No,
because that's just an authentication thing. We're talking about identity and losing access to your credentials. Well, not even losing that. We're just talking about how you do identity in a decentralized world. And is there original thinking that can be done whereby I'm now in control of my identity? However, losing it is a lot easier now because I'm in control of it. What things and mechanisms, controls can we put in place to make it recoverable? Maybe this whole podcast is just about recoverability. Maybe that's what this episode is actually about, is really and truly, how do we build recoverability into a Web3 ecosystem? I also don't think it's binary. Circling back to a point I made earlier, even though I presented it like it's binary, is there is going to come a point where Web2 and Web3 become meaningless, because I would like to see them the features are going to be integrated. Like, as you said, we're seeing in Web2 with, I saw a couple of RFCs, like I think it was demonstration of proof of possession, which is kind of an RFC that is very Web3-y in its understanding of implementing crypto to authenticate someone. So we're starting to see Web3 concepts, philosophical concepts, be implemented in a Web2 world as well. I think there's going to come a point where, or I'd like to see a point come, I'd like to see it come when we won't have this differentiation. It's effectively we've adopted a bunch of standards because you can learn from everything and everywhere, right? Even if you don't necessarily agree with it. And so I think we're going to see a bunch of protocols and a bunch of ways of doing things that from Web 3 going to Web 2. And obviously, we're going to see Web 2 things going to Web 3. And for me and you as well, from our philosophical leanings, we're always going to lean to the side where, as individuals, we have more control, which is where Web3 is obviously is hitting our sweet spots. But some people don't want that control because sometimes you just want the thing to work. It's the same reason why I just have an iPhone because I just wanted my phone to work. I didn't want to hack around on my phone back in the day with other different models, which allowed you to. I didn't want that power. I just need to be able to make a phone call when I need to make one. So yeah, I think that's kind of what we're talking about here, really. We're talking about recoverability, usability, and how you inject that into Web3
Yeah.
while keeping Web3.
And I think there's like maybe one other concept to mix in here.
Go on.
Can I do that? Or do you have somewhere you're going? You want to go?
No. I think we've got 4 or 5 minutes. We can go and do this.
Which is like, we're also when this whole time that we've been talking about identity and we've been talking about recoverability of identity, we've been talking about it as a singular identity, which is not the pattern we have even in Web 2, and also doesn't feel like it is natively the way we're going to be in Web 3 either.
Okay. Go on.
Because like why is losing, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to like make sense with this or not, but like
it's all right. Just
like why does losing access to an identity feel catastrophic? It feels catastrophic if you've bundled all of the value that you hold, and you can think of that in terms of like, actual crypto assets. You can also think about it in terms of like, capabilities within a system or whatever. But if you've like bundled all of the things you value into that identity, right? Maybe all is strong, like a significant amount or whatever, right? But it doesn't have to be that. Like, I guess that's also a constraint that doesn't have to be that way.
Dude, this has just triggered the conversation you and I had offline the other day when I was talking about why I don't.
Yes, it does. It is. Yeah. I'm on your side now.
Identity providers. Yeah, exactly. Because this is the problem. We end up basically clustering all the risk within an email account for all these different service providers, and that isn't good. But that's what Web3 does. Natively out the box, it does that. That's where I'm getting.
It does seem like it does seem like something about it shepherds you that way, right? Because it's like, I generate a key, I have this key, I use this key. Could you design something that doesn't do that though? Maybe like, what if like, I don't know if I want to spitball ideas on the podcast here because they're gonna sound super dumb. But like, I do think there's something powerful about like the MPC concept to this problem. Because like, how do we recover identity in Web 2? Like, there is like a lulz way in which you like contact support and like like social engineer, but it's yourself trying to get into your own account, right? But the other way is that like I have a combination of other things that reconstruct to that identity, right? And like maybe I have like that identity resident in one place that's convenient, but then when that's not convenient because I've lost it, then I have a combination of other things that recombine to that identity, right? And this feels very fundamentally, and like I'm sure there's people who have built things like this already, so like apologies for not looking them up, but like that feels like what something like MPC or secret sharing or like all these ways of splitting crypto identities does, right? Like I have a singular convenient identity when it's kind of fully formed in there, and then like whoops, I've lost that for some reason, but I can reconstruct it out of another set of things that I own and have access to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, agreed. 100%. And that brings us to the 40-minute mark. So in conclusion, there looks like there may be some signs on the horizon of how we can solve the recoverability problem. But you know what problem that doesn't solve is still the bundling, the clustering of value in one singular identity, which
Mm-hmm.
is actually native. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
really glad we've had this conversation because I've now been able to articulate something that I hadn't before. And that's native to Web3 architecture as far as I understand it. Obviously, if anyone watching this or listening to this has opinions, feel free to comment and enlighten us and educate us. The whole point of this, as we said in our very first podcast, is not that we're experts. We're just very enthusiastic individuals who like to think these types of things through and are learning as we go. And we're hoping we're bringing whatever audience along with us for the ride. That's it from me. Michael, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's all. I think we have more topics to go through
I think we
in a
do. I
bit.
think that's triggered something in me.
Okay.
That was really cool. All right. Thank you very much.